Well, do you all remember King Saul? Now, if you did your reading this week, you do. He was in the reading that we had, and there is another insert in the bulletin for you this week if you'd like to read and prepare for next Sunday. But what do you think about King Saul? Right? He's that crazy king who tried to kill David, right? That's what we remember about Saul. How many of you think Saul was an evil king? An evil king. How many would you see Saul as an evil king? I mean, maybe a little schizophrenic. At times he was an evil king. I think there is that kind of thing. And actually what's surprising to many people is that Saul actually did most of what God told him to do. He did most of what God told him to do. And so we're going to look just a little bit in Deuteronomy just to start with and get kind of a picture. Maybe we'll understand Saul a little bit and understand what God expected of kings. But this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And it's God gave rules for what the kings would do. And this is what it says beginning in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You know, God called that back in Deuteronomy. He said, you know, when you guys get in the land, you're going to want your own king. God called it, right? He saw that one coming. All right, this is what it continues. He gives rules. He's verse 15. You are to appoint over you a king that the Lord your God chooses. Who got to choose the king? God. Who always picks the rulers of nations? God. God picked Saul. You read in Samuel, God picked Saul. Okay? He continues on. Appoint a king from your brothers. You are not to set a foreigner over you, or one who is not of your people. The king had to be an Israelite, which Saul was. He was an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin. Verse 16. However, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses. For the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. You know, an interesting thing about Saul is he didn't acquire a lot of horses or build chariots or even build this large standing army. He obeyed what God said here. Verse 17, he must not acquire many wives for himself, so his heart won't go astray. Do you know Saul only had one wife? Her name was Ahinoam. Now, we do find out in 2 Samuel 21 that Saul did also have one concubine. So he did have kind of is that a half-wife kind of? Okay, kind of deal. Her name was Rizpah. But you know, compared to Solomon's 300 wives and 600 concubines, Saul was pretty tame, wasn't he? I mean, he obeyed what God said. And God goes on to say this. He says, he must not acquire very large amounts of silver and gold for himself. You know, Saul didn't build treasuries for himself. He didn't build palaces for himself. As king, I mean, he had wealth, sure. I mean, if you're the king, you're the top dog, you're going to get some money out of it. But nothing in Scripture shows that he used his power to make himself rich. He held court under a tree. God's word continues, verse 18. When he is seated on his royal throne, he is to write a copy of this instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It is to remain with him, and he is to read it from it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and to observe all the words of this instruction and do these statutes. Now, as far as I can find, the Bible never actually tells us that Saul obeyed this or that he didn't obey this. It never tells us that David obeyed this or didn't obey this. I mean, did they write themselves a copy of this instruction? Probably most of the kings did. I would think, you know, Saul, under the guidance of Samuel, probably would have followed this. David, under the same, would have followed it. Solomon probably followed it. We just don't have it written down that, you know, specifically when they did it. I think we do see it with Josiah and a couple of the others. But Saul, the thing about Saul that I think we sometimes miss, we get so focused on the wrong things he did that we miss all the right things he did. And Saul did a lot of right things, but he also did a few things that were very wrong. Those few things that were wrong were enough to ruin his reign as king. Do you know sin still works that way? What may seem small to us, well, that's really not such a big deal. I know God says not to do that, but it's a small thing. Those small things can grow into big things and can contaminate everything. I have a picture here. Would you like some nice, delicious brownies? Anybody like brownies? I like brownies. I like fudge. If it's chocolate, I like it, right? That's kind of my, deal. I heard about a story of a father and his kids were arguing with him. This has to do with the brownies. His kids were arguing with him over what they could watch on TV. Any ever have kids argue about what they could watch on TV? They wanted to watch something. You said, no, that's not a good show. And as the children put it, the dad said, no, this stuff has bad stuff in it. You shouldn't watch it. And the kids put it, but Dad, it just has a little bad language. It just has a little violence. Dad, it just has a little nudity. And if you watched it for an hour, really, maybe 55 minutes of it was okay. Then there's that 5 minutes that ruins it. And I don't know about you, I get sick of movies where, you got a whole movie and they got 90 seconds in it that's got to ruin the movie. You get sick of that? But these kids' their argument to their dad was, just because it's just a little bit, it should be okay. Now, their favorite dessert was brownies. And so he made up a batch with a secret ingredient. Some of you might have heard this story before. He made a batch with a secret ingredient. He added just a little bit of dog poop. Doesn't that make you hungry? Aren't you glad all the snacks on that back table are store-bought? No, I did not make any brownies today. I didn't do that. It's all store-bought stuff, so it's good. Had to pass the health inspector. But if 95% of the ingredients in your brownies is normal good stuff, it shouldn't bother you that 5% is dog. Should it? That's okay. It's mostly good. You wouldn't want to eat those brownies, would you? See, here's the point. A little filth, a little sin mixed into your life will ruin all the good stuff you do. Saul did a lot of good stuff, but the little bit that he did wrong was enough to ruin everything. And it ruined his life. It ruined his kingship. What if we as a church do lots of right things and we do lots of good things, but we have a few sins that we haven't dealt with or don't want to deal with? What can that do to us? Same thing. It could ruin all the good we've done. When you read through the churches in Revelation, we looked at that. I guess it's been a little while now, but Jesus didn't list to the churches and say, you've committed every sin in the book. With each one, he said, you have this one problem. And that one problem in most cases was enough that he was saying, we're going to be done here. Now, our church revitalization team has actually come up with a list of sins that they unanimously agreed to that they believe we as a church have struggled with. Sins we've struggled with. And maybe they're things that we've thought are no big deal. Maybe they're things that are in our past that we need to look back and look on. More likely, it's probably things we've been blind to. Things we didn't even notice. Remember we looked at King David last week? He had some sins and it's like he just didn't even notice. So that's really kind of what we're going to be looking at over the next couple weeks, is that question of who? Me? Would I do that? Did I do that? And the first of the sins that we're going to kind of look at that maybe we as a church have had trouble with, and see if you can follow this, is maybe there have been moments in our church history where we have been impatient. Anybody here ever been impatient? How about fear? Has anyone here ever been afraid? Have we as a church ever made a decision based on fear? Now, the team thought that, yeah, probably in our history there's been a moment or two where we said, you know what, we're afraid this isn't going to work and we're just going to make an impatient decision. And so we're going to look at that. And at first glance, you might say, well, impatience, everybody has trouble with that. That's no big deal. But I think what we're going to see today is that God has a different opinion. We might say, well, fear, everybody deals with fear. That's no big deal. But I think we're going to see today that God has a different opinion. And that allowing impatience and fear to make your decisions can actually ruin your opportunity to be a part of God's plan. Impatience and fear are the sins that caused God to reject Saul as king. Did you know that was his big sin? He got impatient, he got fearful, and he let that make his decisions. And it led him into sin. And so we're going to look at that. This is what happened. This is 1 Samuel beginning in chapter 13, verse 1. And we're going to see what happens with King Saul. Well, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. He chose 3,000 men from Israel for himself. 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in Bethel's hill country, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. He sent the rest of the troops away, each to his own tent. One of the things Saul did, he didn't make big, massive armies that he kept around all the time. He had his little group of his key men, and then he sent the rest home, and they were called out when they were needed. Jonathan attacked the Philistine garrison that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine garrison, and Israel is now repulsive to the Philistines. Actually, the Philistines got kind of touchy about it if you attacked them. Okay, anybody? Okay, we can get that. Then the troops were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines also gathered to fight against Israel. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And they went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. And I actually have a map here. Michmash would be here. Jerusalem is all the way, if you go down here to the bottom, the Dead Sea would be like over here. And so Michmash is right there in those little mountainous region that you see in the middle of the map. And go ahead and go to the next picture. I got a picture of it. This would be the pass of Michmash. Okay, it sounds like someplace in Kentucky or something you make in Kentucky, right? Michmash, okay. But this would be the pass of Michmash. And so basically what happened is the Philistines were up on this side with their thousands and countless army, this huge army. And Saul and his men are up on the other side with this pass in between them. And his army's shrinking is what we're going to see. Verse 6. The men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, because the troops were in a difficult situation, and they hid in caves and in thickets and among rocks and in holes and cisterns. And some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They ran to the other side of the river. Saul, however, was still at Gilgal, and his troops were gripped with fear. He waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had set, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting him. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And then he offered the burnt offering. Now what we're going to see here, Saul, he is in a tough spot. He's badly outnumbered, and his army's deserting. It's a bad place. The enemy army's growing, and your army's deserting. Saul obviously needs to take action and get this situation on track, right? He's got to save the day and get Israel where they need to be. No, that's wrong. That's wrong. God's given him instructions. He needs to obey God's instructions. He needs to be faithful. See, understand, God never needs our help to save the day. God's never late. God never loses control. His promises are always fulfilled. And if ever you find yourself in a place where you have to take action to save the day because God needs your help, I'm going to tell you, you have fallen into the sins of fear and impatience. God does not need my help to get things right. And really, the sins of fear and impatience are disguised. They're our polite term for saying we have a lack of faith. Actually, that's one of the things Jesus kept saying to his disciples, right? Guys, why is your faith so small? Guys, why don't you have any faith yet? And I think also sometimes it can be a problem of conceit. I am so important, God needs me. That might have been where Saul was that day. Now, in Saul's case, God had sent them to a certain place, and Samuel had set an appointment. He was going to meet them there by a certain day. That's kind of a weird concept to us because, if I said, well, I'll meet you at the church by next Friday, that'd be kind of weird to us. But in their world, they didn't have watches, and so they would set times. They didn't have mass transportation. They didn't have automobiles, so, they would just say, okay, we're going to meet by this day. Well, the army just gathers together by this day. And Samuel's supposed to be there. And Saul went there, and he's supposed to go and be ready for battle, and he was. He went. He blew the trumpet. He called the army together. He's standing there across from the enemy, and he's ready for battle, but his army is deserting. The enemy's growing. The enemy had more horses than Saul had men. In fact, it's probably not unrealistic to think that Saul was outnumbered 50-1. How would you like those odds? Samuel was supposed to show up on a certain day, and at sunrise on that day, he wasn't there yet. So what does Saul do? What should Saul do? Well, the correct answer is he should wait on God. Wait on God. Do what God said. Trust God. But instead, Saul took action. He took it upon himself to offer the sacrifices to God, which were not for the king to offer. The job of offering the sacrifices was the job of the priests, the job of the prophets, like Samuel. God had commanded this to be done in a certain way. And there's actually a couple kings who get themselves into trouble this way. But Saul's one of them. Maybe we can relate a little bit to Saul's situation. Israel said, hey, we want a king to lead us into battle, just like all the other nations have. But now they have a king, and he's leading them into the battle, and guess what? It's uncomfortable and it's scary. And so they ran to hide in a safe place. They wanted victory without risk. They wanted change without discomfort. And I think we all know it doesn't work that way. In fact, this weekend of all, we should understand victory has a price. We're remembering the price that so many of our nation have paid so that we can have freedom. Do you think it was different for Israel? Victory had a price. And it's not different for the church. I'm going to tell you something. We will never see a victory for Christ if we are not willing to sacrifice to see it. Following Jesus is not safe. He said, pick up your cross and follow me. Following Jesus is not comfortable. Following Jesus is not easy. But following Jesus is worth it. It's worth it. Actually, I feel like we've seen some similar issues here. Our church made a very deliberate decision. We want to reach the community around us for Christ. Now, to say that is to say we're going to go into battle and take the devil's territory. I'm going to tell you, the devil's not going to just hand it over. You're going to see captives set free. You're going to see people who are enslaved to Satan come to Christ. There's going to be spiritual warfare. It's going to be a battle. But I'm going to tell you, as we started doing that, what God has called us to do, it gets uncomfortable. It gets scary. And we have had a lot of people desert. We've had deserters. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying every person that's left our church over the last few years has been a deserter. Some have moved away. That happens. People move away, right? I mean, they moved to Georgia and they said, well, I'm sorry, Pastor, it's a little too far for me to commute every Sunday. Well, okay, I get that. If God moves you somewhere to some other part of the country and you need to be faithful to God and you need to find a church where God's put you. That's important. I've had people over the last few years come to me and say, Pastor, I believe God has called me to be a part of this other church or this church start, and it's what God's called me to do. Okay, that can happen. That's okay. God may move you. He may call you somewhere else. That happens. In fact, it's happened to me. I've been called to other churches before. I've been a part of churches, and I'm talking before I was a pastor, before I was in vocational ministry. I was a member of several different churches, and each time when I changed, it's because God called me. And I felt God's calling, and I was going to go here, and I was going to serve, and usually there was something attached to it as to how I was going to serve. I'm not talking about a professional ministry job. I'm talking about as a member of a church. And wherever God put me, I was faithful, and I went there, and I supported the pastor, and I supported the church, and you know, I may not have always liked it. Confession time here, guys. When I was a church member, I didn't always agree with my pastor. I always supported him, I was always faithful, but I didn't always like what he did or said 100% of the time. That's the truth. There were times that I was in church positions where I was frustrated, and it was uncomfortable. But I was faithful because that's where God put me. And when God moved me, I faithfully went where He moved me. And then I got to the place where I was in pastoral ministry. And you know the strange thing? That God does not come to you when you're going into pastoral ministry and say, "Hey, David, what church would you like to pastor?" You tell me, which. That's not the way it works. You go to God and say, "God, where do you want me?" And people will say to me, in fact, people have even said to me here, "Do you have a resume circulating or do you do?" I don't. I am here because God put me here, and I will be here until God moves me. I'm in His hands. Just as I was at my last church, when God put me there, even though, it was 70 miles out, it was in the middle of nowhere, it was a cowboy church, and I've been on a horse once in my life. But that's where God put me. And I learned to wear cowboy boots and a bolo tie, because that's what that community needed. But that's what God did. And you go wherever God. And I believe that's what every member should do, is you go where God placed you. It's kind of like being a good soldier in the army of Christ. Any of you ever been in the military? I'm sure that, the president called you up and said, "Where would you like to be stationed? What duty would you prefer?" See, it doesn't work that way. Well, it doesn't work that way in the army of Christ either. You go where God sends you. If He's Lord, He makes up the decisions, and you will follow. And I think that's how we all should join churches or leave churches, is because God calls us. But I'm going to tell you, we have had people who haven't moved away, and the majority of people who haven't moved away, when they've left, they've usually said something to the effect of, "I don't like. I'm uncomfortable. This is scary." And what they're really saying to me is, "I am deserting my post. Because it doesn't matter if God's called me here, I'm going to go do something else." In fact, I had one person, I said, "Well, what if God calls you to a church that does this?" They said, "I don't care, I'm still not going." Well, at least they're honest. But that's desertion. Now, that's not the sin we're focusing on this morning. The issue that we're looking at is, how do we as a church respond to the circumstances that we're in after desertion? That's where Saul was. His army's deserting him. They're the army that begged for a king. They're the army that says, "We want someone to lead us into battle and conquer these evil Philistines." And now that he's doing it, they're hitting the road. They're deserting. How did he deal with it? How should we deal with it? Have we allowed our fear or impatience to dictate our decisions? Do we shut down and hide the way much of his army did? Do we try and rush God's plan, not wanting to wait on His timing? Do we take it upon ourselves to move things forward? Which, by the way, just maybe a side note here. I've had several people come to me and they say, "I don't like this change or that change, and I'm out of here." I've had just as many people come to me and say, "You aren't changing fast enough, I'm out of here." Not everybody that's left has left because we changed too much. Some of them have left because we changed too slow. Just a little side note for you, flash. Are we not waiting on God's timing? Do we take it upon ourselves to move things forward and force God's hand rather than stay where God told us to be? Do we begin lamenting what we used to have and start looking for ways to go back? Or do we patiently submit ourselves to God's pruning? I'm going to tell you something. God loves a church, He'll prune it. He'll prune it till it's fruitful. Do we trust God patiently and wait for His outcome? Do we faithfully keep going and doing what God's called us to do, recognizing He's the one in control, and the outcome of our circumstances is in His hands? And our circumstances, by the way, should never change our faithful obedience. Our circumstances should never change our faithful obedience. Now, I know, guys, I'm preaching to the choir because you guys are the faithful who are here. And I know, personally, the last few years has been trial by fire. It's been rough. There have been temptations. Many probably here, even those of us here, have considered, should we give up? Should we run and hide? Should we desert? But I want to tell you the question, and I have had to ask God those questions. God, is this really what you want? Is this really where you put me? But the thing God has said to me over and over and over is don't give up before your miracle comes. Don't give up before your miracle comes. So often we quit too soon. That's what Saul does here. He gives up, he takes action too soon rather than waiting for what God promised, rather than waiting for what Samuel said was going to happen. And it's what we see over and over again throughout Scripture. When God's people allow their fear and impatience to dictate their actions, then what happens is we walk out of God's will because we stop following where Christ has led. But when we respond in faith, doing what God has called us to do, and patiently trust Him for the outcome, I'm going to tell you something. God always shows up at just the right moment, just the right time, perfectly. Look at what happens. Here's the rest of the story. Let's go ahead and go to verse 10 of 1 Samuel 13. Just as he finished offering the burnt offering, the minute he had finished, Samuel arrived. What if he had waited just a little longer? History would have been rewritten. So Saul went out to greet him, and Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Saul answered, "Well, when I saw the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days," Samuel, it's really your fault. "And the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, I thought, the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor. So I forced myself." Doesn't he sound like a teenager here? Okay. "I forced myself to offer the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have been foolish. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have permanently established your kingdom over Israel. But now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be a ruler over his people, because you have not done what the Lord commanded." Samuel did show up on the appointed day. He came late in the day rather than early like Saul wanted. You ever feel like God's waiting to the last possible minute? He does that. That builds your faith. What happens if you don't wait for God? What happens if He's coming at the last possible minute and you decide not to wait that long? Well, Saul didn't. And this is what happened. Saul said, "I saw things were bad and I forced myself to do what I'm not supposed to do in order to save the day. That's kind of my paraphrase version there. And Samuel said, and this is my paraphrase version, "You've ruined everything." Because this battle is nothing in the scope of God's big plan. You think God's worried about the Philistines over there on the other side of this hill? That's nothing to God. Now someone else is even going to get your place as king. The place you would have had if you had obeyed God. See, winning this battle, that was no problem to God. No more than reviving one little church is a problem for God. You think God has a problem here? I'm going to tell you He doesn't. He does not have a problem. What was at stake in this case was how God's eternal plan of salvation was going to play out. Saul missed his chance to be a part of God's bigger plan, to have his kingdom established, his line of kings be the line God chose, because he couldn't trust God for a few more hours. He was fearful. He was impatient. Understand, God can build this church in a blink of an eye. That's not a problem for God. But if we continue to insist on living in sin, and maybe the sins of fear and impatience, then understand God can and will pass us by and choose someone else to do His work in this community. God's work will get done. God's plan will be accomplished. The issue is, do we want to be a part of it? Did God's work for Israel get done without Saul? Sure did. Jesus come without Saul? Sure did. Saul wasn't necessary, but he had the chance. By the way, actually, there's our picture of Michmash. Let's get you a picture of this, because inquiring minds want to know. Israel did win the battle that day. Did you know that? Actually, what happened, Saul's up here with his army, and he said, "Oh, woe is me, I'm in a panic, everybody's deserting." The Philistines are up here, and their 100,000 soldiers and all their horses and chariots and everything. And two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer, with only one sword, by the way, climb that hill and attack the enemy. And the army of 100,000 goes into full retreat. Was God worried? Had God lost control? See, no. God had it all under hand. While Saul's up there panicking, God is saying, "Hey, I got this already handled." Two men used by God, two men who had the faith to risk everything. To say, we're going to go out there and we're going to defeat the enemy. Even if it's 2 against 100,000, we're going to do it anyway because God's on our side. God didn't need Saul and his army. He didn't need sacrifices and religious rituals. God wanted a person who was willing to put everything on the line in faith. You know, the same is true for churches. God doesn't need big churches to accomplish things. Did you know that? God uses little churches too. Size is not an issue with God. God doesn't need churches with lots of money and influence to accomplish things. God uses the humble. God doesn't need churches that have the best of everything. God can take whatever you give Him. You give Him your best, I'm going to tell you, He can make that worth more than the best the world has. God can use a little church, even a little church like the Meadows, I'm going to tell you, to take the whole city of Phoenix, if He so chooses. And if we are willing to dedicate ourselves to Him and have enough faith in Him to obediently risk everything. But your proportion of faith that's being shown is usually equal to your proportion of risk. And if you allow fear to make your decisions, you won't want to take risks. Remember, God took 11 disciples and He shook the world. He's not limited by us. There's enough people here, He could take this whole city, this whole state. He could change the world. But for that to ever happen, we have to be completely given over to Him. We have to boldly say, okay, God, here we are. Whatever the price, do it. I like to always offer people a chance to come to meet Jesus, to say, yes, I want to know Jesus as Lord. And I think that's important. I think often we have come to Jesus for salvation, but have we really come to Him as Lord? Have we said, Jesus, here I am, I'm yours? There's a difference. And so today I'm going to do something just a little different. I'm going to include a little more to this. And yes, if you're here and you need to make Jesus Lord, don't miss out. If you need to enter that relationship with Christ and have His salvation and His grace and His mercy save you, don't miss that today. But we as a church need to make sure we're getting right. We need to be right. Just because you believe in Jesus doesn't mean you're right. We see lots of Bible heroes who believed in God. Maybe King Saul will be one of them. Saul did believe in God, right? He risked a lot for God. The problem is there were certain areas he didn't want to let go of. We need to make sure we're getting right. And maybe you've struggled with the sins of fear or impatience. Guys, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm speaking here as your pastor. I have struggled with fear and impatience. I have struggled with these sins. When the team said this is a problem, we might have had in this church, I'm going to tell you, I'm one of the number one guilty people. There have been moments where I have been impatient with God, wanting Him to get things done faster. There have. I think I really struggled with impatience during the flood. The contractor said they could get this put back together in 10 days. They didn't tell me which 10 days. I struggled with impatience. But you know what? God had it all worked out. God was in control. God blessed us in every minute of it. Maybe in spite of me. I'm going to be honest, I've struggled with fear. It's a hard thing to watch people desert the ship. I've struggled with fear. But we must not let that make our decisions. If you're here this morning, maybe that's you, and maybe things seem out of control. And rather than trusting God, you've tried to hide. Maybe rather than trusting God, you've tried to get control of the situation. Today I want to offer you a chance to come and pray. You'd be welcome to pray with one of our deacons. If you need someone to pray with, you'd be welcome to just come and pray. I don't think it's wrong for us as a church just to say, the altar's open, come and pray. Maybe we should do that more often.